Hey guys, it's Kate, and I hope you are having a fantastic day today. I was playing around with my Winsor & Newton Cotman color set and playing around with different ways to get texture with watercolor. And so I have this video here for you today with a demonstration on 17 different ways you can get texture. So I'm putting on some washes in these papers. I'm working on New York Central cotton paper, and it's 140 pounds. And so I'm just mixing up some different washes in my palette, putting down some squares of color, or rectangles of color, I guess, and experimenting with all the different things. And there's probably 100 more, I'm sure, but here we have 17. So the first one I spread some rice and we'll let that dry. And on the second one I am spreading some salt, and I'm using a couple of different kinds of salt, the sea salt and also some regular table salt, and we'll let that dry too. In the third box I'm just using plain water to add some texture to the page. And that can be done in many different ways, but I'll just drop a couple of things in there for this video. So I have this water dropper and also a spray bottle. So on one side I'm going to do a light mist, so where you can get some of that sort of finer texture. And then on the right side I'm going to add some droplets, and you can see those spread out for that beautiful cauliflower effect. Sometimes you might want that in your artwork, and you can see how it grows. In the fourth box, I'm going to do some alcohol, and I'm going to apply that a couple of different ways as well once I get my paint spread out there. And so I'm just using plain rubbing alcohol from the store, and I'm going to add a few drops with my dropper, and you can see those spread out and make those beautiful sort of balls, and it has a bit of a different look than the water. And then I'm going to add some to my hand and just kind of drop it right in for some of those random dots. Now I think probably all of us have done blotting at some point with tissue, and that can depend on the firmness of your press and all of that. So I'm just going to demonstrate that here, and you can get some really neat looks with the creases in your tissue, and it just really shows up well on your paper. And if you press firmly, you can lift up most of your color if it's still wet. Now here, I'm going to use plastic wrap, and one of the neat things about plastic wrap is you can get some really nice hard angles. It's a little bit more random, and I know a lot of people use it for acrylic paint too, and that's also a really fun effect. But you can also use it with watercolor, and the water, because of its nature, will kind of stick to some of that plastic wrap, and it will sort of gather there underneath where it comes in contact with the paper. And when it dries, it has a really neat look to it. For the third one on this sheet, I broke out a floral stencil, and with watercolor it's a little bit harder to control, but you can use stencils on your page and you can get a pretty interesting look. And it's a little bit more random, and you can use a little bit more of a dry brush, but you can get some really interesting effects that way as well. So for this fourth one, I'm going to use a sponge and dab at my wet watercolor. And depending on whether your sponge is wet or dry, you might get a different look. So on the left here, I am blotting with a dry sponge, and this is just a sponge you can get in an art or craft store. You could also use a kitchen sponge if that's all you have on hand. Now on the right side, I made my sponge a bit damp and squeezed it out and blotted there, so we'll get to see how that dries too. So for this one, I broke out my silicone stamp, just a little leaf, and so I'm going to brush some color on that. And some of you may have seen my video where I was actually using real leaves to stamp on a greeting card. And this is kind of a similar idea. You can paint on your color and drop that in. Now this is wet and wet, so it will spread, but you can still get some of that nice texture and still some of your image outline. And then I also wanted to see what it would be like to stamp with nothing on my stamp and just leave a mark in the watercolor that's still damp. And so I'm going to do that on the left as well, and we'll see how it dries. For this one, I used the handy dandy Q-tip that graces all of our medicine cabinets. And you can use these damp or dry on wet watercolor. And so I'm just going to go through and do some blots to make some little dots. And this would be great for stars and things like that in the background, especially on darker colors, but you can get some neat things with your dots. You can also make strokes with it, and I'm just kind of rubbing with it too. Now with this Q-tip, I'm going to go in damp, and you can see it picks up a lot more paint. And then I'm going to go back over it with dry to wipe up some of that excess water. Now I had some gauze on hand, and gauze is kind of a fun thing to play with because you can get some really interesting texture, and you can also get different texture depending on how thin your gauze is, how much you stretch it out, like what I'm doing here, and also how wet your paper is. The wetter the paper, the more moisture your gauze will soak up, and you can get some interesting effects with that too. Now with this piece here, I'm splitting it up a little bit, and on the right side I'm going to add some paint and some more moisture to the gauze. My paper here isn't quite as wet as you could get using gauze, but you can still get some interesting looks, and you can kind of see I'm sort of dabbing at the gauze with my brush and letting it soak in a bit, and that will eventually make its way to the paper. And so I'm just going through dabbing with my brush a bit, getting good contact with the surface of my paper, and I'm also holding down the other side with my finger and letting that kind of soak up some of the paint on the page. And then we'll let that dry and see how that comes out. Now you can also use stencils wet in wet, and this is much less control, but it still leaves a really neat texture. You can also use stencils at this point to blot up watercolor. So you can use a lifting technique like I'm doing here. I'm going to go back over it with some more paint, but you could lift your stencil here and have just sort of a clean white outline where your stencil marks are. So I'm making sure to get as dry of a brush as possible, and I'm just going over lightly some of those stencils. Now because this is wet on wet, that water will wick a little bit under your stencil, but as long as you expect that, you can get some really neat texture and patterns going on. Now for this one, I'm going to experiment with cardboard, so I peeled a nice thick piece in half and exposing that ridged side. And so I'm pressing that into my paper and letting that soak up some of that paint like a sponge. And that leaves a really neat little parallel line effect. Now for scoring, you could use a palette knife, you can use a stylus, really anything with a hard edge, and it's a great way to experiment. But when that happens and you just kind of make little indents in the paper, and the paint will settle into those grooves and be darker. So whatever color you're using, your grooves will be slightly darker. And it's a great way, especially if you're doing landscape painting, you can make tree trunks and sticks and grasses and just all kinds of neat little textures. Now this one, I'm not sure I have seen anywhere else, but I had a whole bunch of craft foam and I was working on making some homemade stamps. And I wanted to see what the effect would be when you put that on watercolor. So I cut out some shapes. One side's a little bit abstract, and then I cut out a little heart and I pressed that into my wet paint, and we'll see how that dries as well. Another fun thing you can do is to use them as stamps, and if you're interested in making those, just let me know if you'd like to see a video about that, and we can see if we can make that happen. Now, kind of like the plastic wrap, tinfoil is also a neat way you can get some texture. And for this rectangle here, what I'm doing is I'm kind of squishing it up to get all those lovely creases, and then I'm flattening it back out so we can get some crackle action going on in the watercolor for maybe a more subtle effect, but we'll see how that dries too. And I'm just pressing it in there, making sure it has good contact. Now that was 16, but here is our bonus. And it's one of the most fun ones, and you can do this over paint or all sorts of things, but that is dry brush. And I have a video out on that technique as well, but if you use the belly side of your brush and not the tip, you can get some really nice dry brush effects. And then for extra measure, I'm going to use my stencil again and go over that again with my brush and get some more hard edge shapes on there since the paper is not so wet underneath. So I'm just blending a little bit in my little mixing well, and I'm going to go over those with a pretty damp brush. But because underneath isn't very wet, the color will mostly stay put. And there you have it. 17 ways to add watercolor texture. And so I'll start off with the close-up. Everything is dry now, so we can see the dry brush with the stencil over it. And you get some of those sort of rough edges because of that water wicking a little bit underneath the stencil. And then you can see the clean stamp and the colored stamp, the different Q-tips, and the wet and wet stencils, including the blotting. That beautiful gauze, I love that look, and definitely experiment with that because there's a lot of different things you can do. The cardboard leaves those lovely lines, and I love the scoring. That's beautiful. And the tinfoil leaves this beautiful speckle. And the surprising thing of the day was that craft foam. I really loved how that turned out. And then there is our wet on dry stencils, our light and firm press on the dry tissue, plastic wrap, and the damp and dry sponge. And the last sheet, we have the dried result from the rice grains we dropped, the salt and the different texture that left, and the alcohol splashes, and the water drops. So I hope this gives you some ideas with your paintings and different ways you can add texture to your watercolor. And I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, keep creating.